Hello, everyone, and welcome to not the first episode necessarily, but the intro episode. I know it's cliche. I know it's silly that we have to do this, but the reason why we're doing this is so people can decide for themselves after they listen to this and hear my voice, and they can say to themselves, yes, I would like to hear further from Ryan and what he and his guest hosts have to say about Edward Zwick and his filmography. So why am I doing this podcast? Well, this is just a mini series podcast. You could say this isn't going to run on for 10 years or 2 years or even a year. I think the idea is one episode will cover one film and we're going to go in film order. So we're going to start with All About Last Night. And at the time of this intro recording, yes, I have already recorded that episode with my guest host Katie from the Retro Made podcast. Check her out on the Retro Made podcast. And I've got other great guests lined up for other films. All the slots are yet to be filled. There are some films that do not have guest co-hosts just yet. So if you think you've got what it takes to come on my show and crack wise and talk about Edward Zwick and his filmography, give me a shout. The email of this podcast is available in the show notes. And say hi or whatever you want, and I'll read out the emails at the beginning of every episode. So when I recorded my first episode with Kate, at the time, I didn't have a title for this podcast. I just knew I wanted to do it. I knew this was something I wanted to tackle. I was like, well, of course you got to have flicks. You know, you got to have, because it rhymes with Zwick, and it's almost too obvious. And I told Katie at the time, I think it's in the recording, that, you know, it's too cliche, it's too easy, it's too on the nose. And despite my best efforts to come up with a better podcast name, it didn't happen. So, folks, this podcast is called Zwick's Flicks, the Ed Zwick podcast. Look, it's not original, but you just cannot not do it. It has to have the word flick in it. But what are we doing every episode? So why are you going to go on this journey with us? I'm telling you right now that you can listen to an episode and still watch the movie that we talk about, even if you haven't seen the film. Or if you've seen the film that we're talking about and you really enjoy the film or not enjoy the film, I think you'll still enjoy our comments regarding each film. Because what we're doing is we're not just going to go scene by scene and give the plot analysis for every film. I mean, there's a lot of film podcasts out there, and they do that sort of thing. That's not of great interest to me, because if you want to know the plot by plot of a film, go watch the movie. But there will be scenes, obviously, that we're going to talk about, moments of the film that we want to address and talk about. That's part of the natural conversation. And I'm not one of those podcasts likes to have a huge structure per se, but this one will have a little bit of a structure compared to the other podcasts I've done, just because it is a mini series of sorts. So for this podcast, what we're doing is we are going to use the movie as a catalyst of sorts to talk about the actors from the film, what those actors might mean to us, the genre of film that we're watching, whether it's a comedy, a romantic comedy, or a thriller, or a historical piece, whatever naturally comes to us during the conversation. So we'll then, of course, talk about scenes, but also what was this movie to us at the time? Did we just watch it for the podcast? Did we grow up with the film? Whatever the co-host and myself will bring to each movie. So we want to use that as a conversational piece. And I think the listeners will also be drawn into that discussion, because they will then experience themselves, hey, this is a new film for me, I better go check it out. Or I heard their review of the film or talk the film, I'm not going to check it out. Or I'm going to relive the same experiences that Ryan and his co-hosts are having with the film. Of course, some of his big films, many of us have seen. Legends of the Fall, Glory. These are some of the big films. But there's some other films that I personally haven't seen of Ed Zwick, and by doing this podcast, it's going to force my hand to watch those films. His first film was such a film, About Last Night. I won't say any more about that film, because you're going to have to listen to the episode that will be coming out after this intro episode. But Edward Zwick definitely has a style and a flair that I enjoyed. And the films where he nails that flair and nails that touch, he nails, and I love it. Also, with each episode, we're going to draw from Ed Zwick's biography about films. I'll be playing parts of the audio from his audiobook onto the podcast, and we'll be discussing the things that he says about the films that we're covering at that time. So join us for that journey. Of course, I encourage all of you to go out and buy his book. The book is called Hits, Flops, and Other Illusions. It's written and narrated, the audiobook, by Ed Zwick himself. So I won't take too much more of your time. I just want you to hear my voice. Hopefully it's a voice that you don't mind hearing. Take the journey with me as we go through Edward Zwick's filmography. We also won't be covering his television films that he did before. These are the theatrical filmographies that we're going to tackle. He's produced, executive produced TV shows. We'll touch on those things during our discussion. But again, we are just focusing on his actual theatrical films. Lastly, people are probably already wondering or asking themselves, well, I wonder if Ryan will ever talk to Ed Zwick on the podcast. Hey, I would love to. I would absolutely love to. And if anyone who's listening to this podcast happens to know Edward Zwick and could reach out to him on my behalf, that would be absolutely amazing. If I could talk to Mr. Edward Zwick himself. And if we do, then I suspect that would be the final episode or close to it. Well, folks, that's about it. I hope you'll give it a listen. Again, I can't say enough how great that first recording went with Katie when we talked about last night. I think it's a fantastic start to the podcast. And right after that episode, 2 or 3 weeks after that one, we'll be releasing Glory. And Glory, of course, that amazing film of the Civil War, I'll be doing with Doug Greenberg of the Rocky Minute podcast. So check us out, folks. Lots of great guests are already coming up. Have already reached out to me when they heard about it. Check out my Twitter. Check out the Facebook page. Links in the show notes, as they say. Oh, yeah. And give me a rating and review. Get the show up there, folks. We need your help. Thanks so much. And we'll see you on that first episode coming up soon.